everyone, you're listening to Code Switch, the show about race and identity from NPR. I'm B.A. Parker.
And I'm Gene Demby.
Everybody wanted this job. I said, there's one man for this job, and I have no doubt he's going to be fantastic.
On Monday, March 23rd, Senator Markwayne Mullin was officially confirmed as the new head of the Department of Homeland Security.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Secretary.
This is a huge job. The person in this job is in charge of ICE and Border Patrol and TSA, and they generally set the national tone on how we approach immigration enforcement.
Yeah, and Mullen is stepping in to replace Kristi Noem. Earlier this month, Kristi Noem was fired in the wake of some really high-profile bad press for the DHS.
Bad press, she says with understatement. As our listeners know, immigration officials shot and killed 2 people very publicly in Minnesota earlier this year during protests about ICE raids that were happening in the Twin Cities.
And Noem was known as being extremely hardline. Some of her highlights included an ad campaign to convince undocumented migrants to self-deport, which I saw pretty much every day for like 2 months on TV.
If you're an illegal alien living in the United States, this runway is your future.
And then there was the more recent controversy. It was over a $220 million border security advertising campaign that featured Noem on horseback.
Anyone who searches for freedom can always find a home here. But that freedom's a precious thing, and we defend it vigorously.
There's also footage of Kristi Noem in a Salvadoran prison standing in front of a cell full of detainees, like using them as a backdrop.
Here at CCOT today and visiting this facility. And first of all, I want to thank El Salvador and their president.
The Trump administration still touts her as, quote, the most successful DHS secretary in history, even though they fired her. And she's been moved into this role as special envoy for Shield of the Americas?
Whatever that means.
Yeah, nobody seems to know what that is.
Yeah. So now we've got Senator Markwayne Mullin, and he's had a pretty unusual pathway to public office. He's a former professional MMA fighter. He also ran his family's plumbing and HVAC company for years. And then he was elected to the House of Representatives, where he served for 10 years. And he's been a U.S. Senator for the state of Oklahoma since 2023.
That is a really interesting pathway to this job. But, like, what makes him, like, qualified to do this job? You know what I'm saying?
And an actual question that has been asked by many people. But one of the reasons he's on our radar, in addition to stepping into this big, important role, is that he's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. So he's the first indigenous person to head up DHS. But his politics are potentially a bit surprising. So, like, on most policy issues, he lines up pretty squarely with President Trump, which makes him a bit of an anomaly in Indian country writ large.
Okay.
Yeah, but then again, he's hugely popular with some prominent indigenous leaders, including Chuck Hoskin Jr., the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And among Cherokee people in general, our guest today says it's actually not uncommon to be white, highly conservative, and Christian.
Debt-free. A rancher, man of faith, and father of 3, Markwayne Mullin shares our conservative values.
He's not a traditional Republican, but he is a very traditional Oklahoman. I guess I'll put it that way.
Our pal Graham Lee Brewer has been following Markwayne Mullin's career for years now, trying to understand this big question.
Is he good for Indian people? Is Markwayne Mullin's political career something that benefits Native Americans?
So we wanted to talk to Graham about who Markwayne Mullin is, what his politics might mean for Indian country, but also what we can expect having him step into this new role that has the potential to affect so many big policy things, including, for example, election enforcement.
Oh, man, yeah. I remember after the 2020 election, President Trump asked the Department of Homeland Security to seize voting machines in swing states. Bananas.
Yes, he did. So that's what we're getting into today on the show. What Markwayne Mullin's new role might mean for the country.
This message comes from Indeed. For small businesses, the right hire can make or break success. Relying on hope that the right candidates see a job posting isn't an effective growth strategy. Instead, match with candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results now with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Receive a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed.
Graham, you've been on the show before. Can you just remind us where you work and what your focus tends to be on?
Yeah, I write for the Associated Press's race and ethnicity team, and I cover Indian country specifically.
All right. For some, right now, Senator Markwayne Mullin's name came out of nowhere when President Trump nominated him to head the Department of Homeland Security. Now, when did you personally start following his political career?
I first became interested in Senator Mullen about 6 or 7 years ago when I was working at High Country News on the Indigenous Affairs desk. And, as I mentioned, he's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, which is my tribe. And I really wanted to answer this central question of, is he good for Indian people? Is Markwayne Mullin's political career something that benefits Native Americans? The reason I got interested in answering this question is because I was kind of comparing him to another congressman from the state of Oklahoma, Tom Cole, who is a representative from southern Oklahoma, and he's a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. Mm-hmm. Tom Cole's whole career, at least in Indian country, is really heavily defined by the good things that he does for tribal nations, protecting sovereignty, passing legislation that recognizes it and affirms it. And Mullen didn't really have that same kind of identity, and so I was kind of curious what his political acumen was when it came to sovereignty and policies that affected Native people.
All right, so we're going to get to that question in a minute about whether Mullen is good for Indian country. But I wanted to talk to you about his politics and this nomination more broadly. I mean, from the onset, Mullen has been called this political outsider. So, right now, were you surprised by President Trump's nomination of him?
Yes and no, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Yes, because he has no experience running emergency management systems. And so in that regard, even at the topic of immigration, it's not something that I would necessarily put at the top of Mullen's kind of policy points and things that he's known for. But no, in the regard that he has a very, very close relationship with the president. Over the last, I'd say, probably decade, Mullen's staff and himself have worked very hard to build that relationship. And about 6 years ago, Mullen's son suffered a wrestling injury. He's a high school wrestler. Mm-hmm. And the president really responded to it and showed great interest in his son Jim's recovery. And the two really bonded over that and became very close. And since then, I've talked to former staff and people who work closely with Mullen over the years, and they all say that Mullen has no problem speaking his mind to the president, which, as I'm sure you can appreciate, is kind of a rare quality, even among Republicans, to challenge the president.
But also, okay, I think when trying to break down who is Senator Mullen, what are his politics generally speaking?
His politics largely align with the president's. I'm having trouble thinking of any platform the president has put out there that Mullen has disagreed with. I think a lot of people would say that when you ask them, what do you think Mullen's policies are on immigration, they would tell you that they're whatever the president's are. Mullen has had opinions in the public that differ from the president's. I'm thinking specifically of the January 6th riots. Mullen mm-hmm. was kind of had a moment in the press because he was very visibly part of that day. There was that kind of famous photo of him
ducking,
kind of ducking in the pews of the Congress floor, and there's the January 6th rioters at the door and the Capitol Police kind of barricading, and Mullen actually tried to engage with the rioters and to try to dissuade them and to get them to leave. And he called the Capitol Police heroes. And, he was a witness to Ashley Babbitt's shooting death. And so But the president has described these things very differently. He's pardoned the January 6th rioters. And so that's just like one thing that comes to mind. But at the end of the day, Mullen also, aligned with the president that the election was stolen. And so I think that's one area that I'm very curious to see how it'll play out in terms of policy and action. Because as you recall, in 2020, Trump tried to order DHS officers to seize ballot machines. And, it begs the question that after the midterms or whatever, if Trump asks DHS to do that again and Mullen is in charge, what he'll do.
It's interesting because it seems like Senator Mullen is really trying to toe this line. It's really complicated line. And I know you wrote about him back in, I think 2019, where you noted that Mullen being a very conservative white Cherokee lawmaker wasn't a contradiction. But
no,
sorry.
No,
go ahead. No.
Well, I was going to say, that when you were setting that up, it really made me think of the fact that Mullen is really kind of known for towing that line, even in Congress. He's kind of known as a peacemaker in a way, which is really interesting because I think publicly when you see Senator Mullen speak on television, certainly in some of these Senate committee hearings, like when he got into an argument with the head of the Teamsters Union and said, well, let's take this outside.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up.
Oh, hold on. Oh, stop it.
Is that your solution? Every
Hold it. No.
A lot of people have this perception of Mullen based on those media appearances. But within the halls of Congress, he's kind of known as a deal maker between the parties. So, when he was in the House of Representatives, he started doing a bipartisan workout on the Capitol. And he made a lot of friends through that. Back then, Tulsi Gabbard was a Democrat. They became close friends. Representative Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, former Representative Joe Kennedy. These are all, Democrats that if you ask them today what they think of Senator Mullen, they only have positive things to say about him. They say that he's kind, he's willing to listen, he's willing to change his mind, and that they think that he can kind of help build more bipartisan relationships as DHS secretary. One of the things that I found really interesting when I was talking to Gottheimer specifically about Mullen and what he thought his tenure as secretary would be like, not only did Gottheimer think that he would make a great DHS secretary, but he told me that Mullen was known for inviting Democrats and Republicans to his home to sit at his dinner table and hash out their problems. And I think that most people who see Mullen on TV and have this perception of him as a conservative firebrand would be very surprised to hear that.
A pugnacious mediator. There's this very I'm thinking about this very glaring sight when I'm looking at pictures of President Trump's Oval Office. There's a portrait of Andrew Jackson hanging up in there. And just the idea of working underneath the face who implemented the Trail of Tears. So can you talk about how Mullen's identity fits into the larger landscape of Cherokee identity?
Yeah, that was an interesting moment when President Trump rehung the portrait of Andrew Jackson. And for listeners who don't understand the connection, Jackson was the driving force that led to the Trail of Tears, which was a horrific act of genocide against the Cherokee, not just the Cherokee people, but a lot of tribes. And a quarter of our tribe died along that trail. And that's why many of us are Oklahomans today, because we were removed here. And so I think it really sent a message to Native people. And Mullen, I think, is going to... I'm really curious to see how his identity as a Cherokee person is going to play out at DHS. But to answer your question, Mullen is really just kind of one in a long succession of Cherokee diplomats and politicians who have walked the halls of Congress or lobbied the president's office. Even going back to the moments that preceded the Trail of Tears, which was precipitated by the signing of the Treaty of New Echota. Our chief at the time, Chief John Ross, he was personally at the Capitol trying to get the president to put an end to the violence that was being perpetrated against his people by the state of Georgia. And so I think he's part of that long legacy, which is really complicated. I think our tribe has been kind of intertwined with American democracy for so long. I mean, we were the first tribe, or at least one of the first, I think maybe the first, to adopt a constitution. We developed a court system. We created a newspaper that precedes the New York Times and the Washington Post. Our ancestors did all these things in an effort to assimilate, to show the American government that we can function as a government the way that you are functioning as a government, and we can coexist side by side. Of course, that didn't work, and we were removed. But those facets of American democracy, judicial law, and even journalism, they still exist today in the three iterations of the Cherokee people, which is the Cherokee Nation, the Eastern Band, and the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee. So it's kind of an interesting historical through line that brings Markwayne Mullin to be the first Native American to run DHS. And I think, his experience as a tribal citizen, his understanding of sovereignty, and his understanding of the treaty and trust responsibilities that the government owes to tribal nations, it could actually play a really positive role in his tenure as secretary, because as we've seen with the Trump's immigration crackdown, that through racial profiling, a lot of Native people have been swept up in DHS's jails. They've been stopped and detained. Some report that their tribal IDs have not been taken seriously by ICE officers. And so Mullen could have a direct impact on that. Not only could he use his strong relationships with tribal leaders, because he does have very good relationships with several tribal leaders across the country, not just here in Oklahoma. And he could also implement new training that ICE officers have to understand what a tribal ID looks like and to respect it.
You talk about this a little bit, but how has Mullen's relationship evolved with being Cherokee over the years?
I think that might not be a question I can answer.
Valid.
I can say that it's kind of a mixed bag when you talk to Cherokee Nation citizens about him as a Native person, what they think of him in that regard. Markwayne Mullin grew up in Eastern Oklahoma, solidly in the Cherokee Nation. He grew up in a small community, and I think, the way he describes it when I've asked him in the past, and when I've heard him respond to questions about it even recently, is that, when he was growing up, he didn't really think anything of being Cherokee, in the regard that it didn't feel special to him because everyone around him was Cherokee. He was very much used to being immersed in that culture. And when he got to the Capitol, that's kind of when it dawned on him that he was unique.
I never knew I was special for being Cherokee until I came to D.C., because where I'm from, everybody's Indian or wants to be. And when I came up here, Tom Cole was the first one that came up to me and said, "Congratulations, we just doubled the size of our Native American caucus."
At the time, Tom Cole was the only Native American in Congress. This was before Deb Haaland. This was before Sharice David. And so, and I think that's when he really started to understand the potential power he had to help Native people as a member of Congress. But I also, at the same time, you go back to some of these very traditional pockets of the Cherokee Nation, and there are people who question whether or not he's really has their interests in mind. And so, I really, Cherokee people are like American people. We have a very, varied political views and lived experiences, and we're not monolithic. Markwayne Mullin in many ways really illustrates that through his lived experience. And so, like I said, I think, it really depends on who you ask here in the Cherokee Nation, whether or not his identity as a Cherokee person is gonna help him or help them. And I certainly think that he could have done more for Cherokee people as a senator than he probably could as DHS secretary. But at the same time, I think that his identity as a tribal citizen could play a really big role in how he decides to lead that department.
I think, is Mullen good for Indian country?
I think that's a really difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I think the immediate answer that I want to give is yes, I think it's good to have a Native person in a position of power in the government. However, historically, having a Cherokee person in the room doesn't always mean that that things are going to work out for us, right? I mean, we can see the historical, the arc that has led us to Oklahoma. It wasn't good policy that led us here, right? And there were Cherokee people in some of those rooms who had some ability to impact the situation, but that's just a sentiment I've actually seen. I'm in a lot of Cherokee culture and community Facebook groups, and there's a lot of discourse in those about Markwayne Mullin right now, because a lot of people in those groups grew up with him and know him personally, and that's a sentiment that I see shared time and time again, which is this could be good for us, but we all know that just having a Cherokee person in the room doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome is going to be good for Native people.
Well, then what does it mean to have an Indigenous person hitting up Homeland Security?
I think just having a Native person as a cabinet member means that perspective is going to be represented. One of the hallmarks of the second Trump administration is that the treaty and trust responsibilities have been stripped away, and then tribal nations have to step in and say, hey, wait a minute, this funding or this program or this department, it was meeting a treaty right that we established and is long established. These are some of the country's oldest legal obligations. And then those things will come back. We saw it at HHS with the laying off of all the people in the Indian Health Service, and then Secretary Kennedy had to rehire all of them. We saw it in the college system at places like Haskell and IA with funding and staffing levels. And so, and like I said, some people have told me that Markwayne Mullin has no problem telling the president his opinion, even if that opinion disagrees with the president's. And so I think a lot of Native people are hoping that even though DHS might not have direct authority over certain areas of Indian country policy that affect them, that he has the president's ear and that he might be able to advocate on their behalf.
Coming up,
there's these two Mullins in my mind, and I'm not sure which one we're going to get.
Stay with us.
This message comes from Betterment. Their automated investing and saving tools give you the quiet confidence of someone who knows where to put their money. With tax-smart tools that help grow your after-tax returns year-round. Get started today at Betterment.com. That's BETTERMENT.com. Investing involves risk. Performance not guaranteed. Betterment is not a tax advisor, nor should any information herein be considered tax advice. Please consult a qualified tax professional.
Parker.
Gene.
Code Switch.
Parker, you've been chopping it up with Graham Lee Brewer, who's of the Associated Press, and he's been telling you about what we might expect from Senator Markwayne Mullin, who is President Trump's pick to replace Kristi Noem at the Department of Homeland Security.
Right. Before the break, we looked at what his nomination has meant for Indian country specifically. But I also wanted to ask what we know about Mullin's relationship with immigrants, specifically undocumented immigrants, who will arguably be the most affected by DHS. You told me an anecdote from Mullin's time running his late father's small business that was informative of his past relationships with undocumented people.
Yeah. So I talked to Mullin's former chief of staff when he was in Congress, and one of the interesting things that he told me was that in Mullin's mind, when it comes down to immigration policy, he separates it into two separate categories, and that is border security and immigrant labor. And he wants a strong border, but he also understands the importance of immigrant labor. And the way that played out in his real life is that, so when Mullin was in his 20s, his father became ill. and he took over the family business, Mullen Plumbing.
Hi, I'm Markwayne Mullin with Mullen Plumbing, the Red Rooter. Bring a tip of the day. How do you clean your garbage disposal? Well, let me show you. Take you a wooden spoon and a pitcher.
And if you live in Oklahoma, you've seen the red Mullen Plumbing vans, all over the place. They're everywhere. It's a very large business. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that would happen a lot is that people would come to him as an employer and say, I'm trying to go through the legal process of becoming a U.S. citizen, and I need a sponsor. And so Mullen actually sponsored a lot of his employees through that system.
Really?
And was very proud of that. And from what I understand, after they were able to receive citizenship, he helped them, get on their feet, really kind of welcomed them into his home. And that's, like I said, that's something that he took great pride in, even though he doesn't really talk about it very much publicly. In fact, I'm not sure that I've ever heard him talk about it publicly. But yeah, I think, again, like that's one of those things that I think most people would be a little bit surprised to hear, because, he really has been, especially in recent months with the immigration crackdown, has really been supportive of the president's move. He's said on social media that ICE officers should be, respected, and that they're valued members of our community, and that they're doing good work. And he's suggested that the children of undocumented immigrants who were born here in the United States should be deported if their parents are, and so these are some pretty hardline conservative views on immigration. But at the same time, like I said, he has utilized immigrant labor, and he's helped people go through the citizenship process as a sponsor.
I'm thinking about just like the comparing and contrasting Senator Mullen with someone like Kristi Noem. The way that Mullen has been talking, do we expect, what differences do we expect with a potential Mullen leadership?
Well, I think the most obvious one to me, as someone who covers Indian country, is his relationships with tribes. Kristi Noem was banished from almost every reservation in her state when she was governor. She had very contentious relationships with tribal leaders there. She sent a letter as secretary to it's called, a Dear Tribal Leaders letter, which is kind of, the government does this a lot, where they send letters to tribal leaders and explaining a policy or something that they should expect to happen in the future. And she sent one recently to tribal leaders saying that there is no evidence that tribal citizens have been detained or even jailed by ICE. And we've talked to several people who tell us otherwise, that it happened to them. And so I think a lot of tribal leaders saw that letter as disingenuous. Mullen, on the other hand, has really, really good relationships with tribal leaders, especially here in Oklahoma. And so I think the most immediate difference between the two is that he's going to be able to use those relationships to hopefully carry forward a better, kind of a government to government consultation process with tribes. And I also think that, just his reputation as a kind of a bipartisan deal maker in Congress will also help him, just on a basic level. I mean, we've definitely seen a lot of Democrats and even some Republicans who are not happy with Kristi Noem's tenure as Secretary of DHS. And so, I think Mullen comes into this position with an opportunity to really capitalize on that by listening, by being more available, and by being willing to change policy in a way that reflects what Congress and the American people would like to see out of DHS.
Okay, so Graham, some of the reporting I've seen, including some reporting coming out of NPR, has seemed to subtly position Indigenous people and immigrants against each other, and basically suggesting that Indigenous people should not have to suffer the same indignities that immigrants have come to kind of expect. And I'm curious what you make of that.
Well, I think, it's kind of insult to injury, right? To be a Native person and then be told by immigration and customs enforcement that you potentially don't belong here. Just on its face, that's a pretty insulting position to take. And so I think really that's more of what I've seen. I haven't seen any evidence that Native people have any animosity towards immigrants or undocumented immigrants either. I think it's really more of the injustice of the whole situation, right? Like our ancestors fought and died for our right to be here and to be respected, and in many cases to stay on our homelands and have access to those places. And so I think, this flies in the face of generations of struggle. And so really, I think that's the central conflict for Native people, is that it's not so much that they have, hardline opinions on immigration. It's that I as a Native person, as a tribal citizen, should be able to walk anywhere in this country unbothered by immigration and customs enforcement.
Yeah. All right. So many members of the Trump administration have a reputation for being fairly brusque. And in some ways, I think Markwayne Mullin fits that pattern.
Sure.
He's been called out for his expressions of anger, for the famous trying to asking the head of the Teamsters if he wanted to fight. But you've also described Senator Mullen as this kind of likable and sensible guy who is popular with a lot of his colleagues, including Democrats. So which Markwayne do you think we're likely to see expressed as potential head of DHS?
I think it's an excellent question. It's one I've thought about a lot. And it's also one that I have a really hard time coming to a conclusion on. And that is because, there's these two kind of Mullins in my mind, and I'm not sure which one we're going to get. And one is the kind, charismatic, bipartisan, kind of broker of peace, if you want to describe him that way. And the other is the one that's incredibly loyal to the president. And I get the impression that he, almost sees President Trump as like a father figure, and the way he described Trump's interest in the well-being of his child, of his son Jim's recovery, and offering to fly the family to California for treatment and to pay for the treatment, and checking in weekly on the progression of his rehabilitation, and just taking a genuine interest in the well-being of his son. That really, really impacted Markwayne Mullin.
Dang it. I hate getting emotional. See, if I talk about my kids, I get emotional. Other than that, you can't make me cry. But anyways, he grabbed my son and he said, do you know why I love your dad? Do you know why I love your dad? Kristi tells the story better than I do. And he goes, no, sir. He goes, because he loves you. Because of you. Because of you. Man, he didn't do it for any other reason. I mean, here's the president of the United States, and he did it just because he cared. And so when you want to say why he's a friend, yeah, we were acquaintances before that. We've been friends ever since.
I bring up that story because that's the other side of Mullen that I wonder if that's who we're going to get as DH secretary. Are we going to get someone who is willing to listen and change their mind when necessary, or are we going to get someone who is going to do what the president asks, no matter the cost? And I think it's very possible that we'll get a secretary that's somewhere in the middle of that. But at the end of the day, as DHS secretary, it's going to be his job to carry out the president's policies. So I'm definitely going to be paying attention to how his relationships with tribes become a part of his tenure as secretary, and certainly any training that he provides or mandates for ICE officers when it comes to their interactions with Native people and specifically dealing with tribal IDs. But I am also very curious to see how his time as secretary will play out if the president asks him as head of DHS to play any role in the election system. Like I mentioned earlier, in 2020 he tried to get DHS to seize voting machines, and I wonder if Mullen is someone who voted to not affirm the election, if he would listen to that order or if he would disagree with the president. And so, yeah, I think that and I think let's be clear, Markwayne Mullin is very untested when it comes to heading a department of this size, and certainly one that deals with law enforcement and border security and national security. These are things that he's not really known for, and so I think a lot of people are kind of watching to see what kind of secretary he's going to be, and if he has the wherewithal and the experience to be a successful DHS secretary.
Oh boy. All right. Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, of course.
And that's our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. If email is more your thing, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. And subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter.
And just a reminder, y'all, that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and to support public media you might have heard we could use your support. And you can listen to every episode of our show and other NPR favorites sponsor-free. So please go holler at that at plus.npr.org/codeswitch.
This episode was produced by Jess Kung. It was edited by Leah Danella. Our engineer was Robert Rodriguez.
And we will be remiss if we did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch Massive. That's Christina Kala, Xavier Lopez, Dalia Mortada, and Yolanda Sangway. As for me, I'm Gene Debbie.
I'm B.A. Parker.
Be easy, y'all.
Hydrate.
This message comes from IXL. Spring is here and school testing is just around the corner. IXL can help. Make an impact on your child's learning. Receive 20% off an IXL membership if you sign up today at IXL.com/NPR. This message comes from Jerry. Many people are overpaying on car insurance. Why? Switching providers can be a pain. Jerry helps make the process painless. Jerry is the only app that compares rates from over 50 insurers in minutes and helps you switch fast with no spam calls or hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Before you renew your car insurance policy, download the Jerry app or head to jerry.ai/NPR. This message comes from Bombas. When you're playing sports, you're focused. Your socks should be too. Bombas engineers socks to fight sweat and cushion impact for every sport. Visit bombas.com/NPR and use code NPR for 20% off your first purchase.